Hello, and let's get ahead and start building the iteration 2. Our goal is to display in the address book here a list of all the contacts that we have. So first we want to customize create the classes that represent the new data type, the contact class and the contact data source. Then we want to use it inside the address book table view controller in order to feed the table view with the information. So we add a new file, and then I'll add the contact and the contact data source first. Then we come back to the table view and customize it to use them. So we'll work on the model first, then we'll work on the view and the controller. So first, we want to add a new file. And it is a CocoTouch class. And next, this class is not connected to any of the user interface components that we have. So it will be subclass of this called NSObject. The NSObject is the root class for all the other classes we have, and it basically has some basic information. You can create a class without being a subclass of anything, but it is better to connect your classes to the library to make sure that any features that are expected by collections, by any of the other library tools, that it is there in your class as well. So then we name the class, so I'm going to call this contact. So this is the class that will represent the contact data type, and the language is Swift. Next, you specify where do you want it to be, so I'm going to keep it inside the group, and then say create. So Swift, the template creates the class, give me some information here, and then it imports the user interface kit. And I'm not going to use the user interface kit actually, so I can delete that. It's not needed for this class. So here is class, that's the keyword. Oh, I need it, I guess, for the NSObject. All right. So class and the contact, and then you extend the extension, and then the NSObject as the base, and then the body of the class. So this is the name of the class, this is the class keyword, this is the body of the class, this is the connection between the class and a parent class called NSObject, and here is information about the NSObject and what it does. So what we need in the class is to add attributes. We also call them instance variables, or variables with the class scope, and then add class initializers, then add tasks or functions. We are going to add attributes initializer, and then we'll add tasks and functions in the extra credit parts. So we have 3 attributes to add. The first one is an attribute to represent the first name, and this will be of type string, and you can decide to initialize it or not to initialize it. So we'll say that we're gonna initialize. Since I'm using initializers, I can leave it like that and initialize it later on. Xcode is objecting because you can either say I don't care, I'm not gonna initialize it, or you need to provide an initializer class. And I will be providing an initializer class. So for variable last name string, and then variable email address, and this is also a string. If you want to add other variables like phone numbers or other information, address and so on, you provide it over there. The class initializer is a special type of function. It is called init, and the init function follows that keyword. You can have a function with default arguments, meaning that no, it doesn't take any arguments. or you can provide some arguments. So we'll use both of them. And then you provide the body of the function. So the init function will initialize the different attributes of the class and will be called automatically, so you don't actually call it, but every time you create an object of the class, you call that init function. So we'll say that maybe this is the default value. We'll say you can say John Doe and then the last name, and so that's the initial value. Or maybe you can initialize with your information. I'm gonna initialize with my information, and then email address, and then will be, so these are the different initializers. And it's giving me a message. Oh, so because the init is a member also of NS object, so I am overriding the definition of init. So it requires me to add the override keyword. If I'm not gonna extend NS object, like if I'm gonna take that out and not extend NS object, which I can do that, then I wouldn't need to do the override. So this is an initializer that initializes the attributes to preset values or default values. We can also provide an initializer that initializes to a user given values. So I can say init and make another one. In this case, I want to provide some parameters. So I will say I want to provide a parameter for the first name. So I will say first name, and this will be of type string. Then I need another one for last name, and this will also be of type string. Then I need another one for email address, and this will be of type string. So I added 3 parameters to these functions, to this function. This is the parameter name, or the variable name. These parameters are what we call local parameters or local variables, and inside the function init, this function inside it, you can use that to refer to whatever value the user provides. So when the user initialize a contact, they can pass to you 3 values, or this initializer is saying send me 3 values as you initialize a contact. The first, whatever you put in the first, has to be a string, and I'm gonna hold it in this variable called fn for the first name, the second like that, and the third like that. Then I'm going to initialize my attributes. So I'll say I'm gonna take the first one and put it in the first name. I'm gonna take the second one and put it in the last name, and I'm gonna take the third one and put it in the email address. Yeah, I thought that it shouldn't have an override, because that's not the parent class here does not have a function. This is a very special initializer, and it is one that we need ourselves. You can have as many of these initializers as you want, as long as you have different types, different parameter numbers, different parameter types, or you provide different names. So I can provide actually a name for the parameters that will tell the user what this is. So if I want to tell the user that the first parameter is going to be used to display the first name, I can type here first name. So when you type, Swift allows you to type a name for the first parameter. So the user, when you start using this function, it will show a first name so that you know that the function expects a string parameter in the first attribute, and that string parameter will be called first name. I can do the same for the second parameter, and I can do the same for the third parameter. These titles are not variables. This is the variable. The one right before the string, that's the variable. These are just names to name the variable and to differentiate the initializer from one to the other. So that's the creation of a custom type called contact. It has 3 attributes and it has 2 initializers, one that initializes with preset values and the second one initializes to user defined values. So let's move on and create another class to encompass contacts inside an array. So we add another file, ContactDataSource class, and we're going to call this the Contacts data source. This is the class that will serve as a data source for the contacts. We're going to save it in the same location. So this is the contacts. And this class will have one variable, one attribute. So again, define the attributes, properties or instance variables. Then you define the initializers. And then third, define tasks or functions. So we have one attribute, and actually I think I can use let because I'm not going to be reassigning this. So I'll say let contacts. I'm going to call this collection contacts. And I can specify the type like that and say this will be NS mutable array, and then initialize it to NS mutable array. And here is how I will call the initializer. Use the parentheses. So the NS mutable array class in the library has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It has 8 initializer functions. Notice you do not see the word initialize here or init here. You don't see it. But when you use the parentheses, you're automatically calling the init function. So the empty parentheses calls the default init function, and the parentheses with parameters calls the init with the corresponding parameters. So here we're going to initialize to NS mutable array, which creates an array and initialize it. So we define the contact, we initialized it at the same init line, so it was initialized in the same line that it was defined. So that's why I use let, because I'm not going to reassign any other array to contacts. I'm going to access contacts, so let will be sufficient. Swift also supports what's called the type inference, which means that if the right-hand side is mutable array, Swift will understand that the left-hand side has to be mutable array as well. So this column NS mutable array to explicitly specify that contacts is of that type is redundant when you have a right-hand side to the initializer. So I can delete that and leave it like this. So this is saying we are defining contacts as a constant and initializing it to a dynamic array. Then we need to create initializers. So I will create one initializer and default initializer. And what I will do in this initializer is create sample contact and then add the contact to the array. So in the initializer, so I'll make sure that the array has something. So to create a sample contact, I'll say let sample contact equal, and then use the contact class. So here is the contact class. Here is how I'm using it. And then I will call the initializer. And as you can see, there are 2 initializers that I can use. I can use the one or call the initializer without any parameters, or call the one with the parameters that we have used. Notice that Xcode, when it gives you what the parameters are, it used the title that we provided, not the variable name. So it's very clear to us what needs to be provided, and I can make this as explicit as possible without affecting the inner variable that I was using. So I want a sample contact, so I'm just going to use that. So create a sample contact, then add that contact to the array. So I say contacts, and in the NS mutable array there is a function called add object that allow you to add an object to your array. So I added that, and now my array has one item. Some of the tasks that we need to add to the array in order to support the table view controller is a task to give you the count. So we create a function and say count of contacts. And this function doesn't receive any parameters, but it needs to return back a type of integer. And once you specify that a function needs to return by using this symbol, the dash followed by the greater than, and providing the type, the function needs to have the return keyword followed by something of that type. Here I need to return the count. So I can say, all right, 1. This means that the array has one contact, but I don't really know how many contacts the array actually has. So I need to ask the array itself how many contacts it has, and the array in fact has a function called count that returns int. It's a variable called int, and if you notice, the int matches the type that we are returning. So that will return the count of all the contacts. Another function I need to support the display of contacts is a function that gives you back the actual contact. So I will call it contact at index. So you provide it an index and it gives you back that contact. So this needs to receive an index. So contact index, and I will give it the variable index, and the type here is integer, and this one will return a contact. So it will go to the array and ask the array to provide a contact and return that contact there. So I can call the array directly in the same function, or I can define a variable called temporary contact. So this is a temporary contact, and ask the array, because the array works the same way as NSArray, and say give me object at index. Remember the object at index, and then use the index as the variable, but this will give you the object of the type any object, so I can then convert that to the type contact. So it gives me the object and converts it to the type contact, and I can then return that temp contact. I could have replaced the temp contact and used this one directly the same way I did here. So I didn't really have to create that temporary location in order to return it, but you can use it for if you want to remain explicit. So this contact data source class now defined one attribute for NS mutable array. It initialized it to assemble contact, added it to the list, and it's able to return the count of contacts and the contact at index. Now let's go to the table view controller and see what it needs. So a table view controller, and look over here, it has a table view inside it, or maybe if I bring the document outliner. So here is the table view controller, and inside the table view controller there is a table view, and inside, as you can see, the table view is acting very similar to the view. It occupies the entire dimensions of the device, and it is everything that the user sees. Notice on the right side I have the the connection inspector, and you can see that the data source and the delegates for the table view are connected to this controller. So the table view, similar to the picker view, need a data source and need a delegate, and the controller is behaving as both of them. Inside the table view, there is a table view cell. And the table view cell, if I go to the attribute inspector, you can specify the cell using give it a style. A style here meaning what you want to show on the cell. So you can put on a cell. The cell is a view. It's called a table view cell. So it's a view. So you can add images to a cell. You can add text field to a cell. You can add labels to a cell. You can add combination of more than one component to a cell. There are built-in combinations. So there is a style that give you a title. There's a style that give you two titles ordered this way or ordered this way or ordered this way. I'm gonna use the subtitle, and I will use the last name for the main title and the first name for the detail title. Very important in the table view cell, there's something called identifier. Notice here it says the table view says prototype cell. Let's go back to the table view and look at the attributes. One of the big attributes in a table view is the contents. There are two types of contents: dynamic prototypes or static cell. This is related to, do you want the cells, do you know how many cells in the table view? If you are creating a table view and you already know what it is, like for instance a setting where you have static cells, or when we go and display the details of a contact, we know exactly what those details are: first name, last name, and email address, so we know they are 3. So then I can use static cells. If I don't know, like in displaying the list of contacts, I have no idea at the time of development how many contacts will be there. There could be 1, 2, 500 million. So then I use dynamic prototype, which will then keep generating cells as needed. When you keep generating cells as needed, you ask, are all the cells the same? To make generating the cell easy, the iOS system operates by creating a prototype cell and then making copies of these prototype cells instead of creating a whole new cell object in the for each cell that you want to display. So it asks you here, do you only have one cell type that gets repeated, or do you have more than one cell type? So in our case, all the cells will be similar. Every cell will display last name and first name in this format. So I only need one prototype cell. Once you say I need one prototype cell, you need to provide a name of that prototype, because you will see when we go to the controller, we will use that name to regenerate the cells and add the contact information to it. So in the selecting the table view cell and using a complex or a layered views like the table view controller, the document outliner is much easier for selecting the different items than selecting from the storyboard. So under the attribute inspector of the table view cell, you see the identifier attribute, and we're going to call it the contact cell. So this is the cell that will represent the contact. You can provide, if you want the cell to have some accessories, detailed disclosure, check mark, or things like that. So I'm going to say detailed disclosure because this is a cell that will lead to displaying the details of a contact. So in the list, I will just show some of the information, but then the user will click on it and that will take them to display the details. So I use the detailed disclosure here. So now I set up the table view as a dynamic prototype, very important, either dynamic or static. Decided that I only need one prototype cell. In the contact cell, I used one of the existing styles. I could have used the custom style if you want, and I gave it an identifier contact list. If you open the cell, you will see inside the cell there's a view, and since I used one of the styles, it added two labels. So there's a first label and then there's a second label, as you can see over here. So that's all what I need to do in the storyboard. Then let's switch to the main table view controller and see what the functions are that connect to it. So the table view controller Because we are extending the library, if you look here under the quick help, I double click table view controller. So under help, you see the declaration of the table view controller. So the table view controller is a special type of table view. So it is built upon a table view, and it implements two protocols, UI table view delegate and UI table view data source. So if you wanted to make a separate delegate and a separate data source, you will implement different classes and implement those protocols. You can also view those protocols and see what type of functions you need, but these are already here. So the table view controller, because we created it from the template, it gives us some common features like setting up navigation items. It gives you all the functions. So here are the functions related to the data source, the number of sections and the number of rows, and then all the functions related to the table view controller. You have the cell for row at index path to specify the cell, and then there are different other functions. Can you edit the cell? And if you can edit it, then commit editing style. And you have move row at index, and you have can move row at index, and then you have the prepare for segue for navigation. So we will be using and uncommenting those as we proceed. So first, we need to connect our table view controller with the contacts data source. So we define a contact data source and initialize it here. So var, and I'm going to call it data source equal contact data source, and then initialize that using the default initializers that we define. So that default initializer, this line will call the init, the default init we just created, and it will create a sample contact and add it to that init. Then in the number of sections here, it says it defaults to 0, meaning that the table view has 0 sections. So nothing will appear if you run the application. So we want to say no, there is 1 section. How many rows are in that section? Currently it says 0 rows, but I should have as many rows as I have contacts in my data source. So I will say here data source, and I created a function in the data source that says count of contacts that gives me back integer. So I will call this count of contacts, and that gives me how many rows I have. Currently I only have 1 sample contact, so I will get 1. Then I have the table view, so uncomment the cell table view, that's the name of the function, but the function uses the second parameter title to differentiate this function from all the others. And this function returns a table view cell. So this first line recreates the cell using that prototype identifier. So I called my prototype identifier, I called it contact cell. So replace the identifier here with contact cell. So this, it dequeues, it's kind of recycles the cell. So you already have a prototype cell, so we don't have to recreate it. We can recycle this again and display. Then you configure the cell. So what do I configure the cell was? For each row, very similar mechanism to the picker view. For each row in the count that you have here, it will go through and give you the index of the row and then ask you to give back the content of the cell or the cell itself. So I need to retrieve the index, which comes as index path, when index path will contain the section number and the row number. But since I have only 1 section, I care about the row. So I will say here, let current index equal index path dot row. So that gives me the current index of the row. Then I will go to the data source. Then I will say temporarily contact, and then I will go to the data source and say give me contact at index using that current index. So using the contact index, I will go to the data source and say give me a contact. Now that I have a contact, I can get the first name and put it in the cell. So I could say cell, and the cell will have title label, text label. So this text label is a label, and I can access the text property of the label and put in it the first name from, or the last name. I want to put the last name first. So the last name is the big one. And then the cell itself has detailed text label. And then I will say, put in the text here, the temporary contact.first name. So I use the temporary contact to get a contact object at the index from the data source. This contact at index, that's the function I just created here, contact at index, that goes to my array and gives me back a contact. And a contact is what I created that has first name, last name, and email, and that's the initial symbol that I'm currently using. So I'm basically retrieving that contact and then retrieving the last name and assigning it to the text. Now you will say, how did the cell get access to the text label? Because I used one of the built-in, they are already automatically connected. If you created your own cell, then you will need to retrieve the components that you added to that cell here, and then retrieve their attributes and assign the values that you want to them. So if we did everything correct, we should be able to see the sample contact that we created displayed on that in the list of in the table view. So here is the application, my splash screen, and here is my contact, the last name and the first name, and here are my accessories, and my table is all appearing. When I select it, it selects it, but it currently doesn't do anything upon selection in the, not the next iteration. The next iteration, we want to add a button here so we can add a new contact, and then the following iteration will activate the selection so you can, or maybe actually we can, we'll see what we do. We can swap them, like they are independent. So you can either do the details or do the add new, whatever you would like. So this complete this iteration, and that is iteration number 2.